All right, so welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something that's been causing a lot of talk in Israeli society.
Yeah, a lot of controversy.
It centers around this guy, Professor Avshalom Elizur, who's pretty well-known physicist.
Right.
And he said some things about Sephardic Jews and Likud voters that have really rubbed people the wrong way.
Definitely.
And we've got, I think, like a stack of articles and opinion pieces here.
Yeah.
We're going to try to get through as much as we can.
Okay.
And try to understand, not just what he said, but what it says about Israel.
I think you've hit on some really key points there. This is not just some fleeting news story. This is something that really taps into some pretty sensitive fault lines in Israeli society, around identity and around prejudice and around the boundaries of acceptable speech.
Yeah. And I mean, he didn't just, disagree with people politically.
Right.
He said some pretty outrageous stuff. I mean, talking about Arabs and calling a politician a baboon and even bringing up, Nazi collaborators.
Right. And I think that's what's so alarming is how he uses language.
Yeah.
Because when you use terms like baboon or when you compare groups to Nazi collaborators, this is a classic example of dehumanizing rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
And when you dehumanize someone, you basically strip away their basic humanity.
Right.
And it makes it so much easier to dismiss them or to discriminate against them or even to justify violence against them.
Yeah. And then there's, the thing about the Sephardic Jews.
Right.
You're saying they have Arab mentalities.
Yeah.
It's like, where do you even begin with that?
It's incredibly provocative, and I think it plays into some very harmful stereotypes that have a long and painful history.
Yeah.
And by sort of connecting these negative attributes to Sephardic Jews and then equating them with Arabs, he's tacking into prejudices that have been used to marginalize both communities.
Well, and he even did an interview in English.
I saw that.
So this wasn't just for, an Israeli audience. It makes you wonder if this was like a strategic thing.
Yeah, that's an insightful point. I think that the choice of language and the choice of platform definitely raises questions about intent.
Right.
Was this just a pure emotional outburst, or was there a calculated attempt here to stir up controversy and to advance a certain agenda? It's a question worth considering.
Yeah, definitely. Well, whatever he was trying to do, it worked in the sense that people are definitely talking about it.
Oh, yeah.
We've got sources here with, people just outraged, calling for him to be removed from his teaching position.
Right.
People condemning him from both sides, like Likud supporters, people who don't support Likud, Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews.
That's what's so striking is the sheer volume and intensity of the reaction really highlights how powerful language can be. People felt deeply offended by these generalizations, and many of them saw it as a personal attack.
Yeah.
I mean, his words seem to cut across all these usual divides and unite people in their condemnation.
Mm-hmm. There was this one quote that I thought was so powerful. It said, "The pigments of my skin were deeply offended."
Wow. Yeah.
And it really just got to me how much of a personal attack this felt like for people.
Absolutely. That quote perfectly captures that visceral reaction. Instead of seeing individuals with their own unique stories, he just reduced people to their ethnicity or their political affiliation, ignoring their complexity completely.
Yeah. And it was so interesting to see that, a lot of the people condemning him were Sephardic themselves.
Right. Exactly.
It shows you how diverse that community is and how this whole, Arab mentality thing is just...
It challenges this very narrow view
Totally.
that he's trying to put forward.
It's almost like he was trying to be divisive.
Yeah.
But he ended up doing the opposite.
You could say that his words backfired.
Yeah.
Instead of sowing division, he sparked this backlash that brought people together.
Right.
In their shared rejection of hate speech.
And we even have some sources here comparing this whole Elitzur thing to, incidents where left-wing figures were targeted with hate speech.
It's interesting.
So it seems like it doesn't matter who you are or what you believe.
Right.
This kind of intolerance is a problem.
I think if you zoom out a bit and you look at the bigger picture, this isn't just about Elitzur. This is a symptom of a worrying trend in Israel.
Yeah.
And, in many other places, too, where political discourse is becoming increasingly polarized and nasty.
Yeah.
You demonize your opponent, you exaggerate their differences, and it really makes you wonder, can a society that prides itself on diversity and tolerance, can it afford to ignore these blatant displays of prejudice?
Especially from someone in a position of authority.
Especially from someone in a position of authority.
Yeah, because, that leads us to this whole question of academic freedom.
Yeah.
Where's the line between, allowing people to say what they think and, preventing harm, especially when it's coming from an educator?
That's the heart of the matter, isn't it?
Yeah.
Academic freedom is essential in a democratic society, but it's not absolute.
Right.
It comes with responsibilities. And one of those is to use your platform ethically and to avoid inciting hatred. So it's this very delicate balance,
Right.
protecting freedom of expression while also setting limits on speech that can directly lead to harm.
And then there's the whole social media aspect of it.
Yes, the online amplifier.
Wait,
The way Elitzur's statements spread like wildfire on social media really highlights the power and the peril of these platforms. You know, on the one hand, they can give a voice to the voiceless, but they can also be used to amplify hate speech. And I think it raises big questions about how do we hold these platforms accountable for the content they host?
Yeah.
And how do we create online spaces that encourage respectful debate without shutting down free speech entirely?
Yeah, it's a problem without easy answers.
Yeah.
But it's something we all have to think about.
Absolutely.
Because this isn't just about, Elitzur or about Israel.
It's much bigger than that.
It's about how we, as a global society, deal with hate speech in this online world.
You've nailed it. This whole situation is like a microcosm of a much bigger struggle that we're all facing.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own biases.
Right.
How much tolerance do we have for views that we disagree with?
Right.
And where do we draw the line on acceptable speech? These are questions that we all need to be asking ourselves, no matter where we live or what we believe.
So for you listening, here's something to think about.
Imagine you're a student sitting in Elitzur's class, right? You're there to learn from this brilliant mind, and then you hear him making these sweeping judgments about entire groups of people.
Yeah.
How does that impact, your ability to learn from him, your trust in him?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's not just about, hurt feelings or whatever.
Right.
It creates this learning environment where some students are going to feel unsafe.
Exactly.
Unwelcome. Like they don't belong.
Right.
If you're a Sephardic student or if you support Likud, you might start to feel like your perspective isn't valued.
Yeah.
Or worse, that you're being targeted.
Right, and that goes against the very core of what education should be.
Yeah.
Education should be a space for open inquiry, critical thinking,
right,
respect for diverse viewpoints.
I mean, some people are saying he should face real consequences, like even losing his job. What do you think about that?
It's tough, isn't it?
Yeah.
On the one hand, you have this argument that his words were so harmful,
right,
especially coming from someone in his position, that there needs to be some accountability.
Yeah.
Maybe letting him continue teaching without any repercussions sends a message that hate speech is no big deal.
But then there's the other side of it, like, does punishment actually work?
Right.
Does it actually change people's minds?
That's a valid point.
Does it just drive those views underground?
Right. I mean, maybe a more constructive approach would be to focus on education and dialogue.
Yeah.
Perhaps there's an opportunity here for Elitzur to engage in some real self-reflection, to learn about the impact of his words, to understand the historical context of the prejudices he's perpetuating.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting in the sources was this idea that maybe he's coming from a place of insecurity or fear. He's lashing out because he feels threatened by the changing social and political landscape in Israel.
That's a really interesting psychological angle because it suggests that hate speech isn't always just about pure hatred.
Right.
Sometimes it's a symptom of deeper anxieties, a way of coping with change or perceived loss of power. And if we can understand those root causes, maybe we can find more effective ways to address the problem.
It doesn't seem like there's any easy answers here. It's a complex issue.
Right.
It probably requires a multi-pronged approach.
I think you're right. It's not about punishment or dialogue. It's about finding ways to combine accountability with education and understanding.
Right.
It's about creating a climate where harmful speech is challenged, but also where there's space for people to learn and grow and change their perspectives.
And it can't just be institutions taking action.
Right, absolutely.
Like each of us has to do something.
Each of us has a role to play.
Right.
We can all choose to speak up when we encounter hate speech, even if it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
We can educate ourselves about different cultures and perspectives. We can engage in respectful dialogue with people who hold different views.
Right.
even if we disagree with them.
Yeah.
I mean, silence can sometimes be interpreted as agreement. So speaking up is a way of drawing a line and saying, this is not okay.
Now, before we move on, I want to mention something that really made me think.
Okay.
One of our sources mentioned how Elitzur is similar to another public figure who also said some pretty derogatory things about Sephardic Jews and Likud voters.
Yeah.
And that person ended up becoming president.
Wow. So it's a sobering reminder that even the most divisive rhetoric can find an audience.
Yeah.
And it shows how these social norms around acceptable speech, they can shift over time. What was once considered taboo can become normalized.
And I mean, it makes you wonder, are we becoming desensitized to this kind of language?
That's a good question.
Have we reached a point where outrage isn't enough to create change?
I think those are really big questions that we as a society need to wrestle with. When does offensive speech cross the line into hate speech? And how do we foster a culture where that kind of speech is universally condemned and effectively countered?
It's a challenge.
It's a constant challenge.
But it's one that's worth taking on.
Absolutely.
This is a heavy topic.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the way we talk about each other really matters. Words have incredible power.
They do.
They can wound, they can divide.
Right.
But they can also heal and unite.
That's so well said. I think the Elitzur controversy is a really potent reminder that words matter.
Yeah.
And that we all have a responsibility to use them wisely. It's a call to action, to engage in constructive dialogue, to challenge prejudice wherever we encounter it, and to work towards building a more just and equitable society.
And that brings us to a final thought.
Yeah.
So one of the sources pointed out that Elitzur is like a self-taught scholar.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he came from a pretty humble background and had to, overcome a lot to make it in academia.
Interesting.
It just seems kind of ironic that someone who broke barriers himself would then turn around and, create new ones by putting others down based on their background.
It really is a strange paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it speaks to the complex nature of human behavior. It shows that even those who have experienced exclusion or prejudice themselves can sometimes perpetuate those harmful stereotypes and discriminate against others.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that we all have biases, whether we're conscious of them or not. And that it takes a real effort to challenge those biases and work towards a more inclusive world.
It also makes you think that maybe just focusing on individual success stories isn't enough.
Right.
Like breaking down systemic barriers requires more than just a few exceptional people overcoming the odds.
You're absolutely right.
It takes a collective effort to actually dismantle the structures of prejudice and discrimination.
I agree.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Elitzur controversy, what are the key takeaways for our listener?
Well, I think first and foremost, it highlights the immense power of language. Elitzur's words, which were full of dehumanizing rhetoric and harmful stereotypes, show just how fragile social cohesion can be and how deeply prejudice can run.
It also reminds us that prejudice can pop up in unexpected places, even from individuals who have themselves experienced marginalization.
Exactly.
The diverse range of reactions to Elitzur's statements coming from across the political and ethnic spectrum demonstrates a collective rejection of hate speech and a desire for a more inclusive and tolerant society.
Absolutely.
And finally, this whole controversy really forces us to grapple with some difficult questions.
Right.
Where do we draw the line between free speech and hate speech?
Yeah.
What's the responsibility of educators to foster inclusive learning environments? And what role do social norms play in shaping what's considered acceptable discourse?
Those are really important questions.
Yeah.
Questions with no easy answers, but questions that we need to keep asking.
Right.
Keep discussing and keep working towards solutions.
Yeah.
It requires ongoing dialogue, critical reflection, and a commitment from each of us to create a world where respect, empathy, and understanding are the norm.
Well, we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought, some new perspectives to consider, and maybe even spark some conversations of your own. Because ultimately, the responsibility for creating a more just and inclusive society lies with each and every one of us. Thanks for joining us to